Whenever someone bought a lot of hydrochloric acid, we used to joke, "You must have a nasty mother-in-law in the basement." These were the words of Dagmar S., a saleswoman testifying in a Hamburg courtroom in 1995. What she hadn't realised was just how disturbingly close to the truth her words had been. She continued, "This man was a regular customer. He repeatedly bought dozens of litres of hydrochloric acid. At first, no one thought twice about it. Certain trades required the chemical, but Lutz Rainstorm's true intentions were far more sinister. Lutz was no ordinary killer. He enslaved his victims for weeks, taking pleasure in inflicting as much pain as possible, meticulously documenting their torment. This case felt more like a horror film than real life, and the man at the centre of it all would go down in history as the acid bath murderer." I don't know how this case isn't spoken about more. It's truly the stuff of nightmares. Like with most German cases, the names of the people involved are not fully disclosed, and the images are scarce, so please bear with me, because what happened is absolutely brutal. But before we dive in, if you find this video fascinating, then please drop it a like and leave me a comment below. And if you are new here, then please consider subscribing and following me on Instagram. It all really helps. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse or condone the criminal actions described within. Like many of the people I cover, Lutz Rainstorm seemed like a perfectly decent guy on the surface. He was a sociable, friendly neighbour, always ready to lend a hand, crack a joke, and host barbecues for his friends and family. With his charming demeanour and large social circle, he appeared every bit the devoted family man, living a happy life with his wife and young daughter. Sure, he could be a bit of a show-off, but no one minded. Everyone liked him. But beneath the harmless exterior lurked a monster, a sadomasochistic killer who took pleasure in the suffering of others. Little is known about Lutz's early life, but we do know he was born on March 29th, 1948 in Sassnitz, Germany. When his parents split up, young Lutz moved with his mother to Hamburg, where she opened a fur shop in 1956. The business thrived, providing them with a comfortable lifestyle. It also immersed Lutz in a world of skinned animals, tanned hides, and meticulous craftsmanship, a world that was both macabre and methodical, one that may have shaped him in ways no one could have imagined. As he got older, Lutz formally studied furrery, learning how to clean, soften, flesh and tan hides. His mother intended for him to inherit the family shop someday, and he eventually did, taking it over in the 1980s. In the meantime, once graduated, he worked for various furrers, honing his craft with different shop owners like Kurt K., who owned the largest and wealthiest fur shop in Hamburg. By 1972, he'd absorbed all he could, and he returned to work alongside his mother in the family business. In 1975, Lutz married and soon after welcomed a daughter into the world. They settled into a modest home in Rasted, where Lutz became a doting father and family man. Outside of work, he spent his time gardening, socializing with friends, and swimming at a local club, a place where he befriended a local police officer, a connection that would be very important in the years to come. No one can say for certain what finally pushed Lutz over the edge. Perhaps it was the decline of his business during the 1980s, when the backlash against fur fashion took its toll. He would end up losing his business as most of the trade went under, but maybe It could have been that his wife worked away a lot as a tax consultant, and his home life may have suffered. Or maybe, after years of handling animal carcasses, something inside him snapped. Whatever the cause, only Lutz knew why he made his next move. In 1983, and claiming he feared a nuclear war, he had a fallout shelter built in his garden. At the time, private shelters were government funded, and even the mayor came to open it during a small ceremony. But Lutz went further, adding a small, hidden room, entirely omitted from the official plans, illegally, accessible only by an 80cm by 80cm hatch. He claimed he needed it to dry and store furs. When completed, this secret chamber measured just 4 by 4 meters. Inside, there was a metal bed, handcuffs dangling from a chain, and a hook bolted into the ceiling, a single chair and a camping toilet. It was, in essence, a purpose-built torture chamber. All Lutz needed now was a victim. In early 1986, 3 years after his bunker was completed, Lutz made a series of ominous purchases: several large acid-resistant barrels, a butcher's saw, and 30 litres of 30% strength hydrochloric acid, the strongest concentration available without special permits. There was no suspicion about him buying the chemical, as he had been buying it for years, as it was commonly used in the fur trade. He now felt ready for a victim. He set his sights on a neighbour, the wife of another tax consultant and a friend of the family. Under the pretense that his wife wanted to speak to her, Lutz lured the unsuspecting woman down into the bunker. Through that hidden hatch, he led her into his cramped torture chamber, where he tied her to a chair and handed her a pen and paper. He demanded she write a letter to her husband, claiming that she had left him. But Lutz's plan took a turn when she said she'd already told her husband exactly where she was going, and that he would come looking for her. She looked around the chamber and seen bondage gear and a metal bed. She was terrified. She begged him to just let her go, promising she wouldn't tell anyone if he did. Worried that her husband would come searching, Lutz released her, but first he made her swear to never speak of it again. Against all odds, she kept her word. Maybe it was fear that kept her from telling her husband or the police, but with her silence, Lutz was free to continue down a path that would soon claim more victims. If she had spoken up, these people would not have had to have suffered the way they did. On March 12, 1986, Lutz set his sights on a new victim, the wife of his former employer, Kurt K. Rumour had it that they'd fallen out during the time of his employment, so maybe this was some kind of revenge. Kurt wasn't home that day, but his unsuspecting wife, Hildegard K., was. Maybe he had been stalking them to know their routines. Lutz barged in the house, overpowered Hildegard and tied her up. He then killed the family dog, which was called Donald, and disposed of its remains in the bin behind his own shop. He dragged Hildegard back into his hidden bunker, chaining her to the wall and gagging her. Over the next week, he inflicted horrific torment. Brutal beatings, intimate assaults, and constant humiliation, all the while snapping Polaroid photos of her injuries and the degrading positions he forced her into. Over the course of a week, Lutz used clamps and vices to torture her further, demanding to know where she and her husband hid their valuables. Desperate to end her suffering, Hildegard eventually told him the location of 40,000 marks, stashed behind a cabinet in her house, along with other expensive jewellery. Lutz took her keys and slipped back into the home when it was empty and took the money, valuables, and he also packed a suitcase with Hildegard's clothes and a few personal belongings. But his cruelty didn't stop there. He forced Hildegard to write multiple letters explaining her disappearance. One to Kurt, claiming she was unhappy in their relationship and had left of her own accord, and another to the police, insisting she was a grown woman who had made the choice freely. He got her to write many letters to Kurt so he could send them over a long period of time. Hildegard really suffered horrific abuse at the hands of Lutz. Over the course of that week, she was forced upon countless times and beaten almost beyond recognition. He removed any dignity she may have had left. He took pleasure in telling her that she was going to die and what he was going to do to her. Once Lutz had what he wanted, money, possessions, and a way to cover his tracks, he killed Hildegard. He dismembered her body. Using the saw he bought in the bathtub, wrapped the body parts in foil and submerged them in one of the large barrels he bought full of hydrochloric acid to dissolve her remains. Finally, he buried the barrel in a deep hole in his garden, topped it with a layer of cement, and covered it over, safe from prying eyes. Lutz had planned this attack to coincide with the time that his wife was away for a week, leaving him free to carry out these horrors without interruption. Once Kurt received the letter, seemingly from his wife, claiming she had left him, he immediately sensed something was wrong. Hildegard had shown no signs of unhappiness. They'd recently returned from a holiday that they'd enjoyed together. Worse yet, the handwriting had odd spelling mistakes that she would never make, and Kurt did not believe Hildegard would have had the strength to single-handedly move the cabinet to reach their hidden money. Alarmed, Kurt went to the police, but they dismissed his concerns, insisting they too had received a letter from Hildegard. If she chose to leave, they argued, then it wasn't a crime. They never looked for Hildegard. Tragically, they took the letter at face value. Heartbroken and unconvinced, Kurt and his family searched Hamburg high and low for any sign of her. Obviously, they never found her, as she was already dead, murdered before Kurt even opened that first letter. Kurt filed a missing persons report on September 8, 1986. But the authorities still didn't take it seriously. Occasionally, more letters arrived, painting a picture of Hildegard, enjoying a happy new life elsewhere. Some of the locals began to spin rumors that Kurt himself might have been involved in his wife's disappearance. The stress of these rumors, along with his now failing business and not knowing his wife's fate, took a devastating effect on his health. He developed a heart disease, sending Kurt's life into a tragic downward spiral. For 2.5 years after Hildegard's murder, Lutz slipped back into his charming neighbor persona. He doted on his family, mingled with friends, and waited for the heat to die down. But the urge to kill never went away. On October 5, 1988, he found a new target, 31-year-old Annegret B., a former girlfriend he'd reconnected with through their local swimming club. Lutz had always been drawn to Annegret, a strong, hard-working woman, confident and attractive, but his twisted obsession led him to something far more sinister. Using a fabricated story, he lured her into his bunker, and what followed was even worse than what he had done to Hildegard. First, he beat her and forced himself on her. Then, he hung her from the ceiling hook, clamping her limbs using clamps and vices to clamp her limbs so tightly that blood flow was restricted, turning her skin black and blue. After days of brutal assaults, he forced her to disappear. He dictated letters and postcards, making her right to her family, her boyfriend, and even the police, creating the illusion that she had left of her own free will. He had enough letters prepared to keep the deception going for months. But he didn't stop there. He made her call her workplace and quit. Then, using her keys, he went into her apartment and packed a bag with her personal belongings. He took items that would make it look like she had walked away from her life. Clothing, personal items, and even her beloved sound system. To complete the ruse, he left a goodbye letter on the table for her boyfriend. Annegret was now completely erased from her world, except she wasn't gone. She was still chained up in Lutz's nightmare bunker, alone, with no one coming to save her. For an entire month, she was subjected to beatings, intimate assaults, starvation, and psychological torment. He shaved her head, stripped her identity, and showed her photos of Hildegard in the same chamber, promising her the same fate. Meanwhile, Annegret's loved ones were confused and skeptical. Her mother refused to believe that she had simply run away. Her daughter had a good career, financial stability, and a happy life. It made no sense. Her car was still parked outside her home, and just like Hildegard's disappearance, her letters contained odd spelling mistakes. They were written in her handwriting, but the words felt wrong. Annegret tried to fight back the only way she could, by leaving hidden clues inside the letters. She pressed down harder on certain letters, making them slightly bolder, hoping someone would notice. The letters spelled out help and Lutz. It was a desperate cry for help. It was a brilliant and risky move, but tragically, no one would notice her secret messages for years. While Annegret was locked away, Lutz withdrew 50,000 marks from her bank account, stealing every last piece of her life and dignity. And once he had taken everything, her savings, her identity, her last shred of hope, he forced her to write down in detail the abuse she had suffered. As if that wasn't enough, he made her say it out loud as he recorded her voice. He got a twisted gratification from this final act of control. Then he killed her. Like before, he dismembered her in the bathtub, sealed the remains in a barrel of acid, and transported it, this time to his holiday home in Bazaar. There, he dug a deep pit, so deep he could stand inside it and still be buried by the earth. When a curious neighbour asked about the hole, Lutz calmly lied, saying he was fertilizing the ground. Satisfied with this explanation, the neighbour walked away. Lutz buried the barrel, then poured cement over it, and continued his life as if nothing had ever happened. To maintain the facade of Annegret being alive, he continued to send letters to her mother, pretending she was alive somewhere far away. In a final sickening touch, he even mailed her flowers on Mother's Day, signing them as though they'd come from her beloved daughter. Margaret refused to accept that her daughter had simply vanished on a whim. She pleaded with the police, insisting that although it was her handwriting, the words in Annegret's letters weren't really hers. Yet again, the officers dismissed her concerns. They argued that after all, Annegret was 31 and could legally walk away from her life if she chose. Still determined, Margaret gives the police a list of names and says if anything has happened to my daughter, it would be one of these people who did it. One of the names she gave was Lutz Reinstrom. The police did question everyone she named, but when it came time to visit Lutz, the officer assigned was none other than his friend from the swimming club. The encounter was little more than a checklist exercise. and Lutz easily convinced his friend that he had nothing to do with Annegret's disappearance. Just like before, the investigation stalled. The authorities accepted the letters at face value, and Lutz once again escaped justice. During this period, Kurt K. spent much of his time in and out of hospital. While there, he grew close to a nurse called Krista S., and over time, they began a relationship. Though he still grieved for his missing wife, Kurt felt he had to find a way to move forward. Meanwhile, in 1991, the fur trade that had once sustained Lutz finally collapsed, forcing him to shut down his shop. Now dependent solely on his wife's income, she would now leave more frequently for work. Their marriage grew tense, and the financial strain weighed heavily on him. By September 1991, Lutz set his sights on a third victim, this time with the motive of solving his financial troubles. And who did he know with plenty of money? None other than Kurt K. On September 6th, as Krista S. left her home and approached her car, Lutz struck her from behind. He jammed a taser into the side of her neck, incapacitating her before she could even scream, forcing her into the passenger seat of her own vehicle. He blindfolded her, using glasses wrapped in duct tape. Then he drove aimlessly for an hour, disorientating her before dragging her into his bunker. Kurt had no idea, but his nightmare was about to begin all over again. With Krista imprisoned, Lutz travelled to his holiday home, where he used a public phone to call Kurt. He always had a naturally high-pitched voice, something he had been teased about for years, but now he turned it into an advantage. Disguising himself as a woman, he told Kurt that Krista had been kidnapped and demanded 300,000 marks for her safe return. He promised instructions on when and where to make the exchange, but for now, Kurt was to gather the money and wait for further contact. Kurt wasted no time. He went straight to the police. Unlike in the previous cases, this time it was clear that Krista hadn't left of her own free will. The authorities sprang into action, tapping both Kurt and Krista's son's phone in an attempt to trace the caller, and they were also making efforts to trace the original phone call, but this would take some time. Now, this is the moment when a key figure enters the case. Marianne Azroff-Freer, a seasoned homicide investigator with experience in high-stake cases. She was assigned to work closely with Kurt and Krista's son, standing by as they anxiously awaited the next call. Krista endured the same horrors as Lutz's previous victims, beaten, intimately assaulted, and humiliated daily. Sometimes he entered the bunker just to torment her further, showing her photos of the other women he had killed, and warning her that she would meet the same fate. Other times, he simply just sat and chatted, as if seeking companionship. It was a disturbing blend of sadism and casual conversation. As before, Lutz forced her to write letters to her loved ones and the police, trying to manufacture the illusion that she had left willingly. He shaved her head, hung her from the ceiling, and documented every moment. This time, not just with photographs, but with video recordings. But what terrified Krista the most was that Lutz let her see his face. She knew it meant one thing. He had no intention of letting her go. If he had planned to release her, he would have taken precautions to hide his identity. Yet despite everything, she still didn't know his name. Over the course of a week, he occasionally brought her food, but she refused to eat it, fearing he would poison her. Instead, she requested fruit, believing it was harder to tamper with. It was then, in a small defiant act of survival, that she peeled a sticker from an apple and secretly pressed it onto the metal bed frame. It wasn't much, but it was proof that she had been there, proof that could potentially expose her captor. A week dragged by, with no word from the kidnapper. Kurt and Krista's son were frantic, waiting for the phone to ring. Then, on September 13th, 1991, Krista suddenly appeared at the police station, alive, though shaken, and ready to speak. She recounted her abduction, explaining how she'd been stunned with a taser and dragged into the bunker. But in her confused, traumatized state, many details seemed muddled. Most officers doubted her story, except for Marianne, who believed her account and knew that there was more to the story. But why had Lutz decided to just let her go? Surely this was not part of his plan and was a very risky move. Well, it was, but his wife had unexpectedly returned home early from a trip, and he was not able to finish his usual plan. And like he had done with the first woman he abducted, he made Krista promise that she would not reveal his identity if he let her go, to which she obviously agreed. Then he dropped her off outside the police station, of all places. Krista immediately went to the police, and as she was describing her attacker, Kurt immediately suspected Lutz Reinstrom, given that Margarita had already named him as a person of interest in her daughter's disappearance. Authorities finally decided to take action. 4 days later, on September 17th, 1991, Lutz Reinstrom was arrested, but even in custody, things were far from straightforward. The police had enough to charge him with Krista's abduction. They found the hidden bunker exactly as she'd described, and even discovered the apple sticker she had secretly placed there as proof of her captivity. Yet, beyond that, they uncovered no hard evidence linking him to anything worse. Krista insisted that Lutz had shown her photographs of the other victims and openly admitted to killing them, but disturbingly, most officers dismissed her story as far-fetched, except for Marina, who knew there was more to uncover. Meanwhile, Lutz played the situation to his advantage, using every ounce of his manipulative charm. He spun a story to deflect his sole responsibility. He claimed Krista was his willing accomplice, and that they conspired together to extort money from Kurt. He even said that the torture chamber was nothing more than a shared kink, arguing that everything was consensual. Unbelievably, many officers found his version of events more plausible than Krista's horrifying truth. Lutz had already evaded justice for years, and now he was trying to do it again. In court, Lutz was found guilty of kidnapping Krista, but the verdict was a slap on the wrist. Because he admitted to the charge and had no prior criminal record, he was sentenced to just 3 years in prison, a shockingly lenient punishment considering the horrors Krista had endured. But justice was far from over. As Krista and Detective Marianne left the courthouse, they were approached by a woman, Margaret, the mother of Annegret. She held out the photo of her missing daughter and asked the gut-wrenching question: was this woman in the Polaroids Lutz had shown her? She recognized Annegret immediately. Margaret's worst fears were confirmed. Her daughter hadn't just vanished, she had been one of Lutz's victims. Marianne knew then and there that Lutz Reinstrom wasn't just a kidnapper, he was a murderer, and now she was determined to bring him down for all his crimes. Marianne wasn't just willing to let the case go. She obtained the files on Hildegard and Annegret's disappearances and quickly noticed a disturbing pattern. The letters, supposedly written by both women, followed the exact same structure, contained the same spelling errors and even included their passport numbers at the bottom as proof of their identity. To Marianne, this was undeniable evidence that Lutz had orchestrated their disappearance. Determined, she took her findings to her superiors and pushed for Lutz to be investigated further. But once again, the officers dismissed her concerns. To them, the case was closed. Both women had left voluntarily, and there was nothing more to uncover. Marianne was ordered to move on, but thankfully she didn't. Instead, she worked the case in her free time. She sent letters to a forensic linguist expert who uncovered what no one else had seen: Annegret's secret cries for help. In her letters, she had pressed down harder on certain letters, spelling out Lutz and help. It was the breakthrough Marianne needed. Armed with this new evidence, she bypassed her dismissive colleagues and went straight to the public prosecutor's office. This time, she was heard, and a search warrant was granted to comb through all of Lutz's properties. What they found was damning. In his home, investigators discovered postcards from the very locations where Hildegard and Annegret had supposedly relocated. In a garage registered to Lutz, they found Annegret's beloved stereo system and suitcases full of clothes belonging to both women. But the most horrifying discovery: the Polaroids and videotapes. Lutz had meticulously documented his victims' suffering, photographing their injuries and torment, their helplessness. For the first time, his carefully maintained facade was crumbling. But even when confronted with the evidence, Lutz had an answer for everything. He claimed that they were all friends, and that he had been kindly holding on to the women's belongings as a favour since they had left voluntarily. As for the photographs and videos, he doubled down on the same excuse he had used in Krista's case, insisting it was all consensual, a shared kink between him and the victims. Investigators knew he was lying, but they still didn't have the smoking gun, the irrefutable proof needed to make sure Lutz never walked free again. And so the search continued. Like many cases, a stroke of luck finally cracked it wide open. After the news of Lutz's arrest broke and authorities publicly suspected him of murder, a neighbour from his holiday home in Bazaar came forward. He recalled seeing Lutz digging a hole in his garden and had always thought it was odd. Now it made perfect sense. Investigators wasted no time. On December 1st, they went to the Bazaar property and began to dig. Deep beneath the soil, they struck concrete. Carefully, they removed the slab, and underneath it lay a barrel. The moment they opened it, a putrid stench filled the air, and inside, they could still make out human remains. Annegret had finally been found. Annegret had finally been found. With a body, they had definitive proof that Lutz was a murderer. When confronted, Lutz desperately spun another lie. He claimed that Annegret had slipped, hit her head, and died. Panicked, he said he chopped up her body and dissolved it in acid, not because he killed her, but because he was afraid he would be blamed for her death. The detectives weren't buying it. They told him, "You're already done for, but if you want to make things easier for your wife and daughter, tell us where Hildegard is." For a moment, Lutz hesitated. Perhaps he realized his life was effectively over, or perhaps the doting family man in him surfaced. Then, without a word, he took a pen and paper and drew them a map of his garden and shown where the body was buried. Though he attempted to dissolve both victims in 30% strength hydrochloric acid, the concentration wasn't strong enough to fully destroy the remains. Forensic experts were able to identify Hildegard through dental records, irrefutable proof that she had been murdered. With both bodies recovered, Lutz Reinstrom was charged again, this time for 2 counts of murder. His trial began on January 11th, 1995. Standing before the court, he refused to admit guilt, insisting, and quote, "I am neither a murderer nor a monster." And he also stated that the charges were in fact, and quote, "fantasy." But the evidence was undeniable, and on May 22nd, 1996, the court handed down its verdict: life imprisonment without parole, which was added with a finding of particularly serious guilt, which would ensure he would never be eligible for early release. Subsequent preventative detention was also added, meaning if he ever served his full sentence, he still would not be freed. Even as the walls closed in, Lutz stuck to his lies. He denied both murders, claiming they were accidents. Regardless of what he says, justice finally caught up with Lutz Reinstrom, the acid bath murderer. While searching Lutz's house, investigators made a chilling discovery: a box of human teeth, many of which appeared to have been forcibly removed. The most disturbing part, they have never been identified to anyone. To this day, authorities suspect that Lutz may have had more victims, ones who were maybe never reported missing, or whose remains were too far gone to trace. Sadly, the full extent of his crimes may never be known. But one thing is for certain: Lutz Reinstrom will never be free again. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay sane.